Welcome to a decade that redefined movies as we know them. An era where concepts were high and the budgets were higher. A time when technology allowed for the full reinvention of genres. A period when action heroes evolved, blockbusters nearly collapsed, and a revolution began in the shadows of Hollywood. This was the 90s. This was the end of the century. By the end of the last episode, we were left facing an industry brushing off the warnings of a powerful insider as the rantings of a doomsayer. Fueled by the runaway success of sequels and high-concept projects, Hollywood kept inflating budgets without growing confidence. Spectacle and star power continued to dictate greenlighting decisions, whilst executives remained oblivious to the storm gathering just beyond the horizon. And that storm arrived fast. Within months, two massive productions, each of them ambitious, overconfident, and driven by sheer spectacle, would turn Katzenberg's warning into a painfully accurate prediction. The first came from one of Hollywood's biggest stars of the period at the height of his power. The first real sign of the rampant danger of massive budgets came from a film Hollywood assumed was a safe bet until it turned into the decade's loudest alarm. Waterworld began as a post-apocalyptic, ocean-bound adventure conceived in 1986 by screenwriter Peter Rader, pitched as an aquatic riff on Mad Max. His early draft leaned toward camp, complete with a comedic villain and a lighter tone. As the project development continued, the movie took on mythological and biblical influences. Universal picked it up and greenlit it in 1992 with a then-record $100 million budget, aiming to reunite Kevin Reynolds and Kevin Costner after their Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves success. That past triumph didn't prepare anyone for what followed. What would have been an expensive but manageable production turned volatile the moment the cameras rolled. Reynolds insisted on shooting as much as possible on real water rather than inside controlled tanks, a creative choice that aligned with his vision, but multiplied every logistical challenge. Scenes planned for a single afternoon stretched into multi-day ordeals as boats drifted off marks, winds shifted unpredictably, and stunt crews battled currents that refused to cooperate. Then the hurricane hit. In a matter of hours, the massive floating atoll, months of construction, and the film's central location was torn apart and scattered across the ocean. Sets were swallowed, equipment vanished beneath the waves, and the crew had to be evacuated. The damage alone cost millions, and rebuilding pushed the schedule even further out. Insurance covered part of it, but not nearly enough to stop the financial bleeding. Behind the scenes, tensions grew. Costner, also a producer, reportedly demanded extensive rewrites and pushed for sequences that added days to the already strained schedule. His marriage was falling apart at the time, and his long absences, often spent editing rough cuts in a private suite overlooking the ocean, became industry gossip. Director Reynolds, exhausted by delays and frustrated by studio interference, clashed with Costner repeatedly, until communication between the two all but broke down. He eventually walked away, leaving the Dances with Wolves director to shepherd the remaining shoot. By the time cameras stopped rolling, the budget had soared to a record-setting $175 million. And that was before marketing costs were accounted for. At this stage, the production had taken on a life of its own in the press. Trade papers chronicled each setback with morbid fascination. In the industry coined derisive nicknames like Fish Star and Kevin's Gate, direct comparisons to Ishtar and Heaven's Gate, two of Hollywood's most notorious financial disasters. The joke stuck, and the perception of an impending flop became part of the film's identity long before audiences ever saw a frame of it. Set in the future, drowned by melted ice caps, Waterworld imagines humanity scattered across drifting atolls and scavenger fleets. Mariner, a solitary drifter with a rare mutation, crosses paths with Helen and Enola, a child whose tattoo may point to dry land. Their journey forces them into battles, uneasy alliances, and a sweeping chase across an endless ocean, populated by the jet ski riding smokers, led by the wildly unhinged Deacon. As you may have guessed it, public perception had already cratered before release. Cost per minute estimates circulated. Entertainment Weekly ran anxious updates. Late night hosts turned the production into a recurring joke. Every setback was headline fodder. Then the movie was finally released and the narrative shifted, if only slightly. Waterworld opened in July 1995, earning $88 million domestically and $176 million internationally for a $264 million global cumulative revenue. And in a twist that surprised everyone, it eventually turned a profit, thanks to home video, theme park licensing, and television syndication. If the production hurt Universal, it also changed Hollywood, at least in the short term. Budgets were suddenly scrutinized with a level of rigor not seen in years. Executives inserted themselves into productions earlier. CGI began to be viewed not only as a tool for scale and a calling card for spectacle, but as a safer alternative to massive, risk-heavy practical builds. Over time, the film earned a modest reevaluation. Viewers highlighted its practical stunts, tactical world building, and sheer audacity, especially in the extended Ulysses cut, which added texture and character detail. The Waterworld stunt show at Universal Studios became a long-running hit, outlasting the film's early reputation. Universal survived the turbulence. Smaller studios wouldn't have. For them, Waterworld wasn't a quirky milestone. It was a warning shot, a reminder that one oversized gamble could sink an entire company. And as the major recovered, others weren't so lucky. By the mid-1980s, a wave of smaller production houses began making serious noise in Hollywood. Riding the boom in home entertainment and theatrical demand, mini studios like Cannon Group and Carolco rose from the margins, turning out low-budget thrillers that were cheap to make, easy to sell, and often wildly profitable. Success, however, brought bigger appetites. Before long, these upstarts began chasing prestige projects and blockbuster territory, once dominated solely by the major studios. And for a while, the gamble paid off. Carolco scored huge wins with Rambo, Total Recall, and Terminator 2. But behind the scenes, the math was already breaking down. The hits couldn't fully counterbalance a string of costly misfires, and their growing dependence on large-scale productions weakened the entire company. By 1994, Carolco was in crisis. Credit lines were drying up, and the studio was forced to sell major assets, sci-fi classics Stargate among them, simply to stay afloat. Backed into a corner, Carolco faced the choice between two massive films, but only had the resources for one. The first option was Crusade, a historical epic from Paul Verhoeven and starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, the duo behind the 1990 hit Total Recall. Option 2 was Cutthroat Island, a pirate adventure directed by Rennie Harlin and starring Gina Davis, Harlan's wife at the time, and a certified A-lister with a track record filled with plenty of commercial successes. The studio chose the latter. It would prove to be a decision that sealed their fate. The script had bounced around Hollywood for years, originally conceived as a campy swashbuckler. But as development progressed, the tone hardened and the scope expanded, along with the costs. Carolco approved a $60 million budget, enormous for the period, and things began to go wrong immediately. Michael Douglas, initially cast as the main lead, walked over concerns about his role and the punishing schedule. A frantic recast that saw the studio chasing after virtually every male A-lister at the time led to Matthew Modine, a capable actor but hardly a bankable name. Then the production became a logistical quagmire. Sets were built before Harlan gave final approval, only for him to demand large-scale rebuilds on location. Two full-size 17th century ships were constructed at a $1 million cost each. A sprawling pirate town rose in Malta. Supplies were purchased in such quantity that the island briefly ran out of construction materials altogether. Filming would take place in Malta and Thailand, with open water shoots hampered by storms, strong currents, and pollution. The crew endured constant setbacks, injuries, walkouts, and internal feuds. Harlan fired the camera operator, triggering a mass resignation. Oliver Reed quit after a bar fight. Rewrites were constant. By the end, Cutthroat Island had ballooned to a staggering $100 million cost, nearly double its original estimate. Set in the lawless Caribbean of the 1600s, the film follows pirate Captain Morgan Adams, played by Gina Davis, on a quest for a legendary treasure, aided by William Shaw, played by Matthew Modine. She must outmaneuver her brutal uncle, Dog Brown, a supporting role taken by Frank Langella, evade the British Navy, and navigate a world where betrayal is a constant threat. The film promised grand seafaring battles, sprawling set pieces, and a rare female lead in an action-adventure role. But the final movie failed to justify its scale. Critics tore into the thin plot, sluggish pacing, and the lack of chemistry between Davis and Modine. What should have felt like a rousing throwback came across as disjointed and exhausting. When the title opened in December 1995, its financial problems were already known. The buzz was toxic. The title earned just $10 million in North America, roughly 10% of its cost. Kuroko collapsed shortly after. Its once valuable library was dismantled and sold off. Cutthroat Island became shorthand for commercial ruin, the film that sank its own studio. Ironically, time has softened the judgment. The success of Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean revived interest in the genre, prompting a reassessment of Harlan's efforts. Critics began to appreciate Davis's casting as ahead of its time and praised the film's practical craftsmanship. Real ships, real sets, real stunts. In an age of digital shortcuts, its physical ambition now stands out. But this redemption is purely retrospective. None of it could have saved Kuroko. The movie, once meant to be the studio's revival, became its anchor. Days before it hit theaters, the studio filed for bankruptcy. A public and painful implosion. By the end of 1995, Katzenberg's warning was no longer theoretical. It had come true again, this time with fatal consequences. And Hollywood, once more staring at a market obsessed with scale and shrinking audience, was left to confront the brutal economics of blockbuster gambling. Hollywood likes to believe it learns from its own mistakes. But if the mid-90s proved anything, it's that the industry has the memory of a goldfish. The cautionary tales of Waterworld and Cutthroat Island briefly rattled the studios, but the reflection didn't last long. Within 2 years, James Cameron's Titanic blew past both films' budgets, reportedly costing over $200 million to produce. Insiders were anxious. The production was mired in delays, illness, rising costs, even whispers of sabotage. But after becoming the highest-grossing film of all time and winning 11 Oscars, every fear evaporated. Overnight, the fiascos of 1995 were rewritten as overreactions. The calculus reverted to its old logic. If the upside was big enough, then the risks didn't matter. Executives no longer feared a runaway budget. They feared missing the next Titanic. And with that shift, the blockbuster arms race roared back into life. Studios doubled down on tentpoles, pouring $150 to $300 million into a single project, especially in the superhero, fantasy, and sci-fi genres. The handful of mega hits were expected to support entire slates. But one misfire could still topple a studio. And the warnings continued. Plenty of them. In 2000, Titan AE collapsed at the box office, shuttering Fox Animation overnight. A year later, Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, a tech-driven bet on photorealistic CGI, flopped and took Square Pictures with it. In 2007, New Line Cinema gambled on the Golden Compass as a post-Lord of the Rings franchise starter. When it underperformed, the once independent studio was absorbed into Warner Brothers. The early 2000s also marked the decline of the bankable star. Titles like Eddie Murphy's The Adventures of Pluto Nash and Warren Beatty's Town and Country showed that even A-listers couldn't justify runaway budgets anymore. But the spending didn't slow down. The $200 million budget wasn't a gamble, it was a safe investment in an ecosystem. Franchises became empires. Original ideas vanished from the tentpole space. But beneath the success, the industry's economics were eroding. DVD sales collapsed with the advent of streaming. Theatrical windows shrank. Piracy surged. Yet the boom and bust cycle thrived, untouched and unexamined. Things didn't truly shift until COVID hit, and the massification of streaming rewired the logic altogether. The likes of Netflix didn't just disrupt distribution, they rewrote the rules of greenlighting. In the old system, a movie was judged by box office returns. Over-the-top platforms replaced that with a single metric: subscriber growth. A film didn't need to make money. It just needed to keep users logged in. As a result, success became a Schrodinger's cat scenario. Until officially declared, a movie was both a hit and a flop, but never fully observable. And in the end, risk didn't disappear. It just changed shape. The rules shifted. The habits didn't. Katzenberg's warning that Hollywood would eventually face a reckoning finally came true. The tragedy is simple. The industry didn't learn anything. It just found new ways to fail upward, bigger, faster, and louder.